Good morning, folks. We're going to get started here in a minute. If there are any of the invited representatives on the phone, if you can either text or email me so that we can get you, so I can notify staff that you are on the phone, that'd be great. Thanks. Okay, is the recording on? Wonderful. All right, then we'll go ahead and get started. So I'll go ahead and call this meeting to order. This is a subcommittee of the Housing and Homelessness Committee, the Clean Slate Strategy Subcommittee. We are noticed today from 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. On today, November 2nd, here at City Hall. Let's go ahead and start with Assembly member introductions.
Randy Solt.
Anna Brawley.
Felix Rivera. We don't have any members on the phone. All right, and then we'll go ahead and go to invited representatives introductions.
Sky Nevada, Anchorage Chamber of Commerce.
Yarrow Silvers, East Anchorage.
And then on the phone, I believe we have Miss Ware.
Yes, Taria Ware, Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness.
Great. And if we have any other invited representatives on the phone, if you could either just text or email me. That way I can let staff know that you're on the phone. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So we only have one item on our agenda. Just a quick recap. The last meeting that we had a few weeks ago, we just caught up to speed on how things have been going and on the work for emergency cold weather shelter. And we spent some time on the basics, and that's what we're going to be doing today, is focusing on the foundational questions that we had asked at the end of last meeting. And I have list of those, and we have some slides and discussion to go through some of those foundational questions. Just make sure that we are all on the same page before we move forward. And then once we are all have the same foundation and same baseline, then we're going to really move quickly forward into focusing on locations. And that'll be a lot of the work that we start at our next meeting on November 8th. And I'll get into that in a minute. Okay. So, Ms. Ware, we have our presentation up. We are on slide 150 bed projections for emergency shelter task force. So what I'm going to do for all of these slides is I am going to walk through the questions that these slides relate to, and then Ms. Ware, if you want to speak to them. So slides 1 and 2 really speak to some of the questions that folks have been asking around price. And so one of the questions doesn't address all of these components, but one of the questions that was asked last time is, what is the right size, price, and what do we want this shelter or shelters to look like? So Ms. Ware, I'll turn it to you to walk through these next couple of slides.
Thank you. And I just want to clarify that I didn't see the presentation online yet, but I could have been looking in the wrong space. So I'm going to speak to what I think we have until that point. So when we're looking at the 150 bed projections, this information came from the Emergency Shelter Task Force. And this was the exact numbers that our community members really delved into, what the staffing costs were, what the costs were for running or operating a shelter, and they separated into six sections. So there's a congregate amount, and I'm sure you're seeing there the total expense at the top, the total income, the cost per person. And then in this wonderful graph, it tells you the total cost for the year for a 150 person shelter, right? And that number is basically $5 million, right? Approximately. There's some change there. Then the next column was your least congregate shelter, which would be about $6 million. And then your non-congregate shelter, which is $3 million. And then your hotel conversions, which costs about $2 million. And then, of course, your MOA building housing, which is about almost the same amount of price, which is the $2 million. And then leased hotels, as if someone was staying in a hotel and paying partial rent, and there still might be a cost of $5 million. So that group did a lot of this work and really broke down the cost for each of these and where we could make the choice. And of course, everyone knows ACH's choice is housing. And it also is the cost-effective choice as you're looking at the bar graph. Are we moving to the next page, or we have questions?
Actually, let's not move forward just yet. So what I want to do is just give folks an opportunity before we move on to the next questions, if they want to dive into that specific question any further. So again, these two slides sort of covered in some part, what is the right size, price, and what do we want it to look like? And as folks can see here, pretty evident what the different price points are depending on the structure. Do folks have any further discussion on this slide or questions for the coalition? Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Salt.
Just a quick question. What is MOA housing? Is that?
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
So the MOA housing would be like your Golden Lion.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks. Okay, so then if we can move to the next slide, which is the gap analysis slide, and let me just read through. So this slide, the question forming for this slide through slide 6 is, we need analysis that demonstrates where we are two different points here. So the first one is we need analysis that demonstrates where we are, the 5-year trajectory of how many shelter beds, temporary and permanent, do we need to have until we have more housing come online. So that was sort of the future look, a 5-year trajectory. And then there was another set of questions that relate to the slide as well. Are our assumptions still accurate that led us to the conclusion that we need 150 additional shelter beds? I'm not sure either way on this question, but if our underlying assumptions are wrong, I think it will really impact how we think about locations. I'll turn it to you, Ms. Ware.
Thank you. So, and I did find the slide deck, so thank you for whoever did that. So this was presented and approved by the Advisory Council in February of 2023. It really says the bottom line is that we need about 2,500 beds of housing or shelter. And this reflected the shelter capacity of 350 at the time that it was done. And it used the shelter and program utilization data from HMIS and the capacity map information. What you're seeing here, and I think we can, well, what I will say is that the more housing you have, the less shelter needs you will have, right? And so when we're looking at a 350 bed shelter and housing units that should be coming online, as you see, we separate shelter from and transitional housing because transitional housing is considered shelter per HUD. We separate shelter and housing, which is what this grid is showing you. But then when we looked at it as like a collective, we're like, you know what? At the end of the day, no matter the configuration, we need 2,500 more beds or units. That is what we need. And so if more of them are housing, then you need less of the shelter and transitional housing. Transitional shelter and shelter beds. If less of them are housing, then you will need more shelter and transitional housing.
Great, thanks. Do you want to go ahead and go through the point in time counts, next 3 slides?
Got it. Sure. Thank you. So when it comes to the point in time counts, one of the things that we stated, and I'm on that the first one, which is highlighting total persons since 2012. So our PIT and HIC counts, and HIC is our housing inventory count, and our PIT count is basically our person experiencing homelessness count, right? That we typically used to do, well, that we usually do in January, but we used to do it at our Project Homeless Connect. But recently, we have been actually going out and really making sure that we are getting those unsheltered numbers with the investment from the municipality. So we are seeing, yes, an increase in persons that are counted for 2023 versus 2022. I will caution you that we feel at the coalition that the data is most represented well in the last 2 to 3 years. Anything before that, this is the data that we have submitted to HUD. This is what we will stand on and what was in HMIS. But we really did a push during COVID to say, hey, data is very important. And the municipality stood behind us and said, hey, it is very important, and started putting it in grant agreements so people could really make sure that we are capturing everyone that's being served. So if we're looking at that, the total persons from 2012 to 2023, I really want you to focus on 2021 through 2023, but noticing that those are also 2 what we are going to call COVID years, right? And so the numbers are a bit higher because we did see higher percentages of people experiencing homelessness during COVID. You want me to move to the next slide before questions?
Yeah, go ahead, Ms. Brawley.
So our next slide, go ahead. Thanks. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Our next slide is,
Actually, hold on, Ms. Ware. Go ahead, Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate you bringing up the gap methodology, and now we're looking at the housing inventory count slide. But I wonder if you could just unpack a little bit more, because I know this the housing inventory count is really beds and units, so it's a place where people can stay. Whether that's a housing unit or a shelter bed. And then the gap analysis is really looking at the number of units also that are needed. But I wonder if you could also just talk about kind of, because like you said, this is a point in time. How does the turnover look with these different types of housing over time? And I bring that up because I think it's a really important thing to understand in the gap analysis. It's not saying necessarily that there needs to be the same person on January 1st as there is December 31st in any of these particular situations. Transitional housing is usually up to, some of them are up to 6 months. So there is like two people that are served by the same unit. I just wonder if you could spend a little more time unpacking the difference between the number of people and the number of units, and then how we see that flow happen over time.
So thank you for the question. I can delve into it a little bit today, and then if you want more in depth, I can definitely come back and present that. What I will tell you is this, is that first, transitional housing can be up to 2 years. So it's 6 months up to 24 months for any transitional housing program that someone can stay in. And you're right, it could be double occupancy. Some transitional housing programs have 4 people to a room. So it really varies. When we're looking at length of stay days, that is something that the gap analysis does take into account. And they're looking at the data for the year. So this was the 2020, basically 2022 data, right? That was presented in 2023, but we're looking at the period of 2022. And when they were looking at that, their length of stays were, for single adults, were about 38 days in a year-round permanent shelter, which we were including Sullivan at this time too. So remember, we had longer lengths of stay at the Sullivan Arena than we had previously seen in shelters. Transitional housing, 139 days was the average, and I'm only speaking about single adults because family numbers are different. And then rapid rehousing, which is a housing program where someone is receiving assistance for 3 months up to, I believe, 6 months, but it can go, depending on the funding, up to 24 months. We haven't really seen that much in our community, but that was 181 days. And then for supportive housing, which everyone should find interesting, I did, is that there was about 365 days. So most people stay the entire year in supportive housing, like being able to contact a case manager or a case worker and not necessarily having any financial assistance during that time. So that is kind of where we're at when it comes to how long people are staying in these programs. So you can kind of think about what that turnover would be. The other thing that this doesn't tell you, which is why I said I could go into it in depth a different day, is if we've lost transitional housing beds or if we gained them over 2022. So I don't have that information today, but it sounds like that might be something you're interested in because that tells somewhat more of a story. When we did the inventory for example, transitional housing units or beds, there were 69 for that time period, which isn't a lot of units, and is not counting maybe some units that we know are more for Department of Corrections or other areas that people know that people access transitional housing for. So that is something that we noticed in our gap analysis has been missing, is with the Department of Corrections resources. And did I answer, or sorry, Assembly Brawley, did I answer your question?
I think Member Brawley is good with that response. Thank you.
Okay, great.
All right. I think you were on slide 5, Ms. Ware.
Okay. Yeah. And I also want to say I purposely didn't include the housing inventory counts for any of the 2012 through 2023. You're only seeing the point in time count at the top, but if you go online, you can see the housing inventory counts also. So when we're looking at the second slide, that's really, the line is pointing to, the red line is pointing to the emergency shelter data over the time from 2012 to 2023. And again, you're going to continue to see that increase, especially in those COVID years. But if you look before COVID, where we were slightly increasing, it wasn't as much as post-COVID, or whatever you want to call it, we're in now. And then the third slide is about our unsheltered count. And this is the one that I said, really, we have really been able to capture this data better than any other time in the last year, since there has been an investment made directly into street outreach to be out there looking at folks and actually building those relationships and getting a better count. And so, as you can see from 2022, it changed from 125 to in 2023 in January to 335 people counted that were outside. We also changed our methodology a little bit, and with ICA's help to make sure that we're capturing people in a more robust way with the questions that we're asking while we're out in the field.
Great, thanks. 2 seconds. Okay, so then let me take it back. Thanks for walking us through that. Let me take it back to the 2 questions just to circle back to them and see if we have any other discussion we want. So our assumption still accurate that led us to the conclusion that we need 150 additional shelter beds. It would seem to me that that is still an accurate number for us to be looking at, the additional 150 shelter beds. And I think you made a good point, Ms. Ware, about we just need 2,500 more beds or units. Period. We can make those what we want, and we can heavily invest in shelter and make the system overly built in shelter and overly expensive in shelter, or we can invest in housing, or we can have a balance of the two. And I think what we're trying to do is have something of a balance of the two, where we continue our investments in shelter and continue our investments in housing. And I think you saw that with the appropriations that we made with emergency cold weather shelter, where we did both of those. So for my part, I think that 150 additional number is right. I think more than that, and I think we are probably over investing in that particular area where we could be investing in more housing. But happy to have any further discussion if folks have other thoughts. Yeah, go ahead, Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, this is an open-ended question, but I think folks from the coalition or those working in that space could dive into it. Who do we need the shelter beds for? Because I think that's also important to understand, because each of our shelters does serve a different population. Certainly the Sullivan was the most, I guess, general population, but it was still really serving adults. Folks with kids were not staying there. Certainly folks with disabilities were staying there. But there's other shelters who serve different populations. So I think that's also worth kind of unpacking. And I don't know the right answer, other than I'm guessing it's adults, because that's really the need that we haven't sufficiently served for a long time. And partly why this unsheltered number keeps going up, because you've got the baseline of folks who have been out on the street for a long time, plus more and more people may be getting evicted or not able to afford housing. So I would just be interested in kind of people's thoughts on that, because I think it helps to also better define, who is that shelter serving, and therefore that speaks to what it should look like, what its operation should be, how large should it be, knowing that we don't want to make a large shelter, but maybe less than 150 is appropriate for that population. So anyway, I don't know the answer, but I want to put that on the table as discussion, along with kind of the general total number of people that we're talking about.
Ms. Ware, do you want to take a stab at that now?
So here's what yes, and thank you. Here's what I will say is that when you're looking at the gap analysis, if you go back to that slide, it's pretty clear that your highest need is your single adult need, right? And then your second highest is your youth and K. And there's an asterisk at veterans, because we do separate out veterans for case conferencing, and really want to make sure that we get to functional zero with veterans as a population. But they're also included in your single adult number, which is why it's a blank there. And then there's also families. What I'm going to say is probably going to be complicated more, and Felix is not going to like it, which is you address all of them like the municipality is doing. You are currently investing in family emergency cold weather shelter, which has been full since 11/6, with an overflow at hotels averaging six additional units a day on top of the 7 at the single site. You continue to invest in youth and Tay, because we know those early interventions will stop them from going into the adult shelter, which you are doing. You're also investing in additional space at Brother Francis, and then you're addressing it at emergency cold weather. I will say, though, that if we were also addressing it from the prevention end, and I think Member Brawley did speak to that, that if we were keeping people housed, then we help our inflow, which as a municipality, I'm not sure that we have addressed prevention yet, but I know it's coming. And then the other part is the housing piece. People will continue to stay in shelter and have longer lengths to stay if there's nowhere to move them to, nowhere for them to go. And so it is an all-encompassing attack, I'm going to say attack on this, in order to really make sure that we're getting to the root of the issue. So I stand by the gap analysis numbers. That doesn't mean that next year's numbers or when we do another gap analysis, it won't change. But I do say that all of them are important, and we're seeing overflow situations for every population of people experiencing homelessness, if that helps.
Thanks. I guess just to dissect that a little bit more, Miss Ware, I have a question. So, we haven't really talked about this too much, about the 150 beds that we're looking at, of what populations those are going to serve other than single adults. I think that's the population that this group has talked about, is that what this 150 beds are going to serve. But as we look further into the future, we are considering the possibility of not just one, but multiple, splitting 150 into multiple different shelters, right? Smaller shelters. That's something that folks have talked about in the community, and I'm wondering if, right now we're looking at the location process. That's the next phase we're going to be going into. Does particular population that you're serving impact the location? For example, looking at folks like another complex care, for example, does complex care, by serving that particular population, limit the kinds of locations that you should be looking at, or is it not really a location dependent question?
I'm trying to find a great answer for that. What I will say is this, is that I think some of the criteria that Clean Slate has already addressed, which is making sure shelters aren't in food deserts, close to transportation, we're seeing that those criteria are being met by most of the shelters that we currently have in Anchorage. They're either on a bus route or close to a bus route. There's some place that someone in a wheelchair or walker can access, as we have people in every population of homelessness that might need an assisted device or however. So I think that if you were looking at smaller, diverse shelters, then it would really depend on what your population is. But other than that, the criteria you have set forth already seems to fit for any shelter.
Yeah, thanks for taking it back to that. Now that you did, I remember that we did add ADA compliance as, I believe, one of the required criteria, because there were two tiers: the required and good to have, and I believe ADA was in the required one. So I appreciate that. Okay, so then the second set of questions, and this is a question that Mr. Constant asked. But he basically asked for the 5-year trajectory of how many shelter beds, temporary and permanent, do we need to have until we have more housing come online. And I think you also addressed this question by the fact that we just need more beds and units, period. And I guess it's hard to tell even a year from now what inflow is going to look like. But can you just talk about that, about inflow, and how the coalition looks at inflow going into the future?
Yes. So we are monitoring inflow, and I might need you to clarify the question if I don't get it right, nail on the head here for the answer. But when we're looking at inflow, we're looking at not just people that are new to homelessness, but really people that are returning to homelessness also. And what are those reasons? but we just started looking at that piece of information, I want to say in the last 2 years on the whys, so we can then address what is happening. I can tell you majority of the whys are falling off of programs that lasted 12 months um, with no like follow-up information or case management. Not loss of jobs, medical issues. Those are some of the things, obviously, that led to eviction that we've seen thus far. But we just started really capturing that information. When it comes to inflows, we're seeing differences, and you can see this on our website too. You don't have to take my word for it. But the differences of inflows actually affect the populations, the subpopulations differently. Like when you're looking at families or veterans, the numbers seem to be smaller for inflows, even though they're still coming in, than if you're looking at single adults. And so, if you would like a conversation with the data, and we can definitely have a conversation about inflows versus outflows,
Yeah.
and I can bring the numbers later.
Thanks, Tria. So, and I'm going to assume that the answer to my question is no. So, my question is there any real data driven, realistic way to future project what inflows may look like? And I'm going to assume no, because no one has a crystal ball. So, I'm going to assume that the coalition really doesn't have a good way to look 5 years into the future to see what inflows may look like.
Okay, you're right. No, you're right. No, we don't. And it also depends on like economics that are happening, housing inventory, and that's what we kind of saw with COVID, which is we weren't expecting all of these things to happen at one time. And then we saw that spike that we haven't seen before with people experiencing homelessness. So, no, we don't have a magic ball, but we wish we did. But we can say if housing supply does continue to stay low, and that means that people experiencing homelessness don't necessarily have places to move to.
Great. Yeah, and I think maybe this question will also be addressed slightly when you talk about functional zero, which I think is in one of your future slides. Mr. Solt?
Yeah, just a question for you is, given we don't have the housing for everyone right now, do we need to triage this? And if so, is there a population that is more likely to be successful than others? I.e., should we focus on youth or those that are due to housing, or are there things that we can do in our education system to attack the root causes of youth, or our foster care system to attack those root causes, to basically slow down the influx by addressing the low hanging fruit, because we face it, we have limited resources. Thanks. Or Ms. Johnson.
I'm oh, either
Turia,
way.
you can step in and I can follow up.
Okay, sounds great. Sorry, I was waiting. I didn't know. I apologize. Not being there is interesting. But anyhow, one of the things I was going to say is yes, I think that education does matter, and looking at like what does homelessness look like. We were recently having conversations with UAA about how many students are housing insecure, are food insecure, and a lot of folks wouldn't think of college students as maybe experiencing homelessness, but it happens, and it's happening actually in Anchorage. The other piece to that is really, really looking at our prevention side of the system. If we can keep someone housed, if we can stop them from going into our shelter system, I can't tell you the effect that it has on the family in words. I can tell you what it has on, the effect on our numbers and our inflow numbers, but it is costly. And right now we have, two programs that I know of, and Alexis can speak to the ADRC one doing prevention, but BHAP funds through CSS coming through HFC are only 185,000 for the year. Nowhere near the amount that we're seeing need for in our community for prevention. So those are the two things I'll say, but I do agree with all of it, including an active campaign of what homelessness looks like.
Through the chair to Mr. Solt. I brought forward a point last Housing and Homelessness Committee meeting, just a point of interest is that we have seen more youth. And when I say youth, not just transition age youth, but 30 and under actively living unsheltered this year than we have in previous years. We are encountering young adults at a higher rate. And right now, when we look at them, we say, okay, well, if we can intervene at this point, we can redirect them so that they're not living unsheltered for a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, 4 decades. And I really think that that's something that we've covered with Covenant House and transition age youth, but we have a gap, I would say, between the age of 25 to 30, where you still have someone who is considered a young adult that really has a high likelihood of progressing out of unsheltered homelessness because they haven't had decades of living this type of life. And I really think that's something that we should investigate further because we are seeing increasing numbers of people who are about 30 and under.
Thank you. All right. Any other discussion on these points before we move forward? Sounds like there's a lot of subpopulation work that we can be doing, but I think we're going to continue for these efforts moving forward with our basic assumptions. All right. Then the next few slides get to the question that was asked: can we get results from unsheltered survey conducted by ACH? And so here are those results. Ms. Ware.
Yes, thank you. So so what you're seeing here, the first slide is obviously just a title slide. The second one is, the question says, if there were congregate, like one or more group shelter locations, and non-congregate, individual rooms, sometimes with a roommate option, which would you prefer? And overwhelmingly, it was non-congregate. But the second one was, I would go to either. And then, of course, you see 15 people selected congregate, and then neither were just 9. And I'm going to keep going unless you tell me not to, Felix. Next slide, Member Rivera. Next slide is, do you have any of the following barriers to access shelter? So the highest amount was significant other. And then the next highest category was disability or mobility challenge, then pets, which we know that's a concern, and then the other. And so when we looked at the other, there were quite a few other things that came up as far as location, transportation, those kind of things. And I see that that's the end of that section.
Great. Thanks, Ms. Ware. Yeah, no, interesting data for sure. Not surprised on preference towards a non-congregate. And then also a little bit surprised on the significant other, but glad that we have that data. Can you just talk a little bit about who has this data and how it's being used?
Yes, so ACH conducted or made up this Google form at the end of July to bring to pop-ups and many Project Homeless Connects to collect this data to have a conversation about what people experiencing homelessness want. It's something that HUD values. It's something we use in our collaborative application to say that we are using the actual words from people experiencing homelessness and what their wants and desire and their feedback about the system to help change and inform the system and bring that to policymakers, including AHD. So that is what we did. And that is how we are moving forward. We have not, since shelter has opened, we have not engaged in taking any more surveys, but we're more than willing to continue to do surveys throughout the year for various things. We did it before during the beginning of Clean Slate, asking what kind of shelter do people experiencing homelessness want to have, and presented that data this summer also.
Great, thanks. Yeah, go ahead, Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thank you. This is really interesting data, and like Member Rivera, I'm not surprised that people would choose non-congregate, but I think to the point of the significant other here, it looks like about half the folks, have somebody else in their life that they want to live with. And I think it's fair to say that that's probably true for the general population, right? So what this reminds me, and hopefully reminds others, is, we're talking about people who have different ways of living. They have pets because we all love our animals. They love other people that they want to live with, right? And when we build our systems in a way that even the way that HUD talks about single adults, all it means is that you don't have kids with you. I mean, so we should really think about changing the way that we talk about some of these things, knowing that there are technical definitions, but also just recognizing that we're talking about a lot of different people's living situations, experiences, and it's not just saying, oh, they have preferences. It's really the reality that that's how people live, right? That we want to live in groups. Yeah, and people are more successful, as Ms. Member Salt just said, that they have that support network, that they can stay together, and so when we set up our systems where it's like, oh, the men in one room and the women on the other side, or whatever it is, like that starts to break those relationships, or at least it makes it harder to maintain, and then that works against the general idea of helping people get back on their feet and do what they want to do. So anyway, I really appreciate this, and I think that's a really key point. So I hope that we can continue to make that information and kind of talking through the implications of that as we design these systems.
Thanks. Just to opine on that a little bit, it is interesting. Sometimes I have talked to some providers over the years where their philosophy is to purposefully break those connections, because some providers see those connections as negative, as these connections are what will lead people to experiencing homelessness again, lead them to breaking the rules, and they'll get kicked out of whatever housing that they're in. So it is interesting. I think the philosophy of some providers may differ from, I think, some of the things that you just stated, Ms. Brawley. But I think it's worth maybe looking as a system of how we think about folks' community and the community that they have developed over the years, and how that community can remain intact. And I think there's ways that I think that can accommodate that maybe don't lead people back into whatever negative spiral that they were in before. But it is an interesting point. Okay. Not seeing any other discussion. Then the questions on these next slides was one, will the anchored home plan impact this work? And, in particular, anchored home is getting an update, as folks may know. And so these slides, I think, will address that a little bit. And then there's a second question that's just for this specific slide, which is, what would an exit plan look like for additional shelter? And that'll be tied in with functional zero, which is on this slide. So Ms. Ware, if you want to talk through this slide, we'll pause to talk about the exit plan, and then you'll continue through the next couple slides on anchored home.
Thank you. So Anchored Home and Clean Slate. So Anchored Home has 7 strategic directives focused on permanent housing as the solution. So it really does not address shelter at all. But by ensuring shelter is housing focused, which is what Clean Slate has said, our community can achieve functional zero. And so on this slide, I took an excerpt exactly straight from Anchored Home, and it just says, functional zero is a milestone which must be sustained that indicates the community has measurably solved homelessness for a population where inflow is less than outflow. When it's achieved, homelessness is then rare and brief. I added 2 words, but anyhow. So, and we talked a lot earlier about how inflow is really important and how do we stop that inflow. And I think that is a great conversation for someone, and maybe this committee, to have about prevention services, because that will help us to get to functional zero. And I'll pause for the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, thanks. And just to address the one question, is what would an exit plan for shelter look like? And folks may remember that we actually talked about an exit plan earlier. This would have been 2022, I'm fairly certain, with regard to the proposed Tudor No More Navigation Center, when that was still moving forward for the shelter part of the plan. So in one of the various resolutions passed on that particular project, there was a statement made in it, which the administration and the assembly had agreed on, that basically said, for the shelter side, once we achieve functional zero for single adults, then we would be able to shut down the shelter side of the navigation center and keep the navigation side of the navigation center open. And based on everything that I have learned, that is still, I think, uh, a accurate assessment of what an exit plan could look like for additional shelter. I think we also I think need to look at, when we get there, sort of the population of that we're looking at, to see whether our new baseline of additional shelter that we need. Because I think, especially with Brother Francis shelter numbers going down, I do think that we may need to look at what that basic baseline of shelter in our community is, and so that may impact what the exit plan for shelter looks like. But generally speaking, I think functional zero is a good criteria to look at for us to spark the discussion of, once we've achieved functional zero, can we look at our system of shelter, and do we need to maintain that level of shelter, or can we start to reduce shelter? But until then, I don't think it makes sense to talk about an exit plan. Yeah, go ahead.
Representative McCarty is currently online and wants to be recognized. He says that he's been trying to do so. But.
So yes, I do see that you're on the line, Mr. McCarty. Go ahead if you'd like to speak.
Thank you, Chair Rivera. I do have a number of questions, if I could ask these questions.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. First, I want to go back to a number of, was given of 2,500 beds were needed. And it's not clear to me if that represents the total beds needed, that includes the number of people that are in shelters currently, plus, or if that represents the addition to the number that people are being served. Can you answer that question? And then on top of that, does that represent families? So are we double counting or quadruple counting in that formula?
Ms. Ware?
Yes, thank you for the question. So I will say that we're not double or triple counting, which is why we left the veteran section at almost like a zero. It wasn't a zero, but a line, because veterans are counted in single adults. They can also be counted in families, but there are very few that are usually counted in the family section. What I will say is that for 2022, that was capturing all the data that was put into HMIS for programs participation, and then on the capacity map for programs that did not, that were not utilizing HMIS to capture their data for their programs. I believe that answers the question, but let me know if I need more.
So through the chair, so you're saying that this data doesn't represent all the services that exist already. It's just those of people that are, or those programs, projects that are connected to HMIS?
No, I actually said the opposite. What I said is that it represents those with the capacity map. So that's shelters and transitional housing programs, rapid rehousing programs, all of the things on the list there that actually reported to ACH the work that they're doing and the information that was in the HMIS system.
Okay, appreciate clarification of that. And another question is, you said ACH has done a survey, and a number of them, and this question came up at the last meeting, was what's a national data collection type of mechanism that we're using as we analyze Anchorage, but we're using something that is used nationally? Is there some structure that we've been doing or are going to be doing?
For the survey, Representative McCarty, is that what you're saying? Or for like the data input into HMIS, which has been required in shelter licensing?
Yeah, so other parts of the country have requirements too and such. And as I do just a windshield survey throughout the country and seeing communities that have less number of homelessness, and seen for the National Coalition of Homelessness, and what are their data collection systems, and are we using those or creating our own?
Great. Thank you for clarifying that. So the only data system that I know that collects information on people experiencing homelessness is the one that's recognized by HUD, and that has been AKHMIS or Service Point, that is currently being managed by ICA. And they're in every state. If you're receiving any HUD funding, then your data has to be in HMIS. If you're a youth, there's something called RIMUS. If you can tell, it still has HMIS in it. But the youth data, that when I say youth, I mean minors, so under the age of 18, goes into a different system. It can still go into HMIS, but they have a different grant system for that. And so there is a RIMUS database also. But we are utilizing the database that is required by HUD to capture our data for people experiencing homelessness. We only did the Google form for the survey because there's no real way to do a survey quickly in HMIS, nor should, for a time-limited response, it be something that we collect there. But we do have that data, and we're more than happy to continue to share that with the community.
Okay, thank you. And one last question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, to the chair, that do we have any data collection of the uniqueness of Alaska, and as example, those maybe coming from villages to Anchorage that could go back to the villages, from those that have been, let's say, banned from the village for something they've done? Do we have anything to separate that information?
Thank you for that question. So currently our HMIS system does not capture any birth origin information of where someone is from. We do capture where you stayed last night, which is their current living situation, which is what HUD really wants to know, is where did you stay last night? We do capture demographic information, but not where someone is coming from in specific throughout the state of Alaska at this time.
And are we able to capture that for our own benefit, not just to please HUD, but to know what's the demographics of our issue?
What I can say is that we are able to, if in fact the policy or the advisory council makes the decision to capture that information in HMIS, then yes, we are able to capture that information. It does take 30 to 60 days to get into the system, but once it's in there, that data can be collected, or any data for that example, like we're doing with street outreach.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that'd be really important to know. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Brawley?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to add to that as well. In addition to what Ms. Ware said about HUD data being collected, another national perspective, I was curious because I know there's research out there. There was a study done in 2018 using data from Zillow, and it was a national study. So again, this is 5 years ago, but I think the findings are still true. It found a direct link between the price of housing and the increase in homelessness in a community. The data here says when housing prices force typical households to spend more than 32%, so about a third of their income on rent, those communities begin to experience rapid increases in homelessness. So again, this is from 2018. It looked at a number of different cities. I didn't click through to see if it included Anchorage, but I think it's important to understand we have the national data. The national data tells us that when people cannot afford housing, they end up on the street. And so I think that is what we're seeing here. And I think there's no accident that we've seen the increase in rent, especially in the last 2 years, almost double digits for many people. 7% is the average, but of course that's an average. So that means there's a lot of folks who had a lot more. And then we saw that increase in unsheltered homelessness. I don't think that's an accident. I think there's more than a correlation there. And I think the national data pans it out. So I just want to emphasize we could collect additional data, but I think the data has been telling us the same thing for many years. And that is partly why we are so focused on housing.
Thank you. All right, let's go ahead and move on then to the next couple of slides, finishing up the anchored home discussion.
Right. As previously stated, Anchor Home really does not talk about is I took out three of the sections in Anchored Home and said, these seem to be able to correlate to Clean Slate from what I know of Clean Slate, right? So Clean Slate does focus on making data-informed decisions and analyzing the data, which is something that one of the strategic directives of Anchored Home. So it says data strengthen the capacity of state and local governments, tribes, native serving organizations, and nonprofits to collect, report, and use data. Also, through surveys and town halls, Clean Slate has promoted equity and continues to promote equity by advising shelters to have feedback loops with people experiencing homelessness to improve services offered. So the second one on this slide is equity, and it says to promote equity and seek ways to expand partnership to include people with lived experience and ensure meaningful participation and compensation of their time and expertise. And then lastly, Clean Slate is focusing funding not just on shelter, but housing, as that is the way to ensure our outflow is larger than our inflow. And so there is a section about funding, which is increasing the access to housing and homelessness funding and coordinating and leveraging funding opportunities with existing federal, state, local, and philanthropic funding opportunities. Did you want me to pause or go to the next slide? Because the next slide is just generic.
Go ahead, go to the next one.
Thank you. So the next one is just, and I'm not going to read them all, listing all 7 of the Anchored Home strategic directives, just in case anybody wanted to know. And I'll pause. Member Felix.
Great. Thanks so much, Taria. Okay. So yeah, I think that addresses the question of the impact of Anchored Home. And I think by and large, the work of Clean Slate should not go against Anchored Home. It should, in fact, be work with and go in tandem with Anchored Home. And I think it does. And we've already talked a lot about investments in housing versus shelter and making sure that we are balancing those kinds of investments, which I know is a keen policy of the Assembly. All right, then these last few slides here address the question that was raised. How do we maintain control of these locations for shelter? There was suggestion that we look at the aviator and how they have mitigated impacts. So this is all about the issues of mitigation that we often hear in these kinds of discussions. And I believe the coalition has some great information here, the 5 keys to effective emergency shelter, and I'll turn it over to you, Ms. Ware.
So I know that most of you have seen these slides before. We have talked about this a couple of times. Safety for people experiencing homelessness does equal safety for the neighborhood, right? And so one of the things, and I'm gonna move a little quickly because I know you've all seen this several times, but is the first thing is coming into shelter with a housing first approach. Not coming into shelter thinking we're gonna have a long length of stay, but how are we moving Johnny through the shelter onto housing or onto transitional housing or onto a program, but onto somewhere and not just having to stay stagnant, right? And the emergency shelter is supposed to be supporting the flow from housing crisis to stability. One of the things, and I didn't include this slide, my favorite slide is the HPRS, where it visually shows you how short your stay in emergency shelter should be. It should almost feel like a trampoline, like you are experiencing homelessness, you go into shelter for a quick rare beef one time, and then you bounce out into an outcome, hopefully a positive outcome of some kind of housing. So that's the first thing is your housing first approach. Your second thing is to really have your shelter be a safe, this second slide, sorry, safe and appropriate diversion. So shelter should be able to divert people without having to come into shelter. So for example, I think Alexis spoke last time about there were some folks on the wait list who already had housing, and making sure that someone at the other end of the call talks to them about how important it is to keep their housing, what the current housing environment or housing supply we have. And I myself have had these conversations with people experiencing homelessness. So I know that these are the conversations that you would have, not only at shelter, but if you're just giving resources and referrals and you're saying to people, hey, How can we keep you housed? What is it that you need? And sometimes it's something really simple, like I'm really bored and I have no furniture, or I don't know what else to do, and building a community or giving a referral to 3RNC. So making sure that our shelter staff not only know the resources in the community, but are prepared to help keep people where they are that is currently safe. And that will help our inflow also. Next slide talks about immediate and low barrier access. And so making sure this is talking about a welcoming environment for people, a place that you would want to go, making sure that it's clean, that it's safe, that it's designed in a way where you would want to be there and spend your time there and move through quickly, and how you're greeted and how you're treated in that space. It also talks about eliminating policies that make it difficult to enter shelter or to stay in shelter. And then next slide, we talked about housing focus and rapid exits, or housing focus. This one more talks about rapid exits, and I know I touched on it again, but I'll say it again. I'll say it another time. Is making sure the goal of the shelter is how it operates. So the goal of the shelter is not just to get people in and keep them warm, but the goal is to get them out and to get them housed. And so when shelters are serving that specific purpose, then we know that their outcome is going to be focused on that specific outcome. And we should be able to see that, if you're looking at our next slide, in the data. So we want to constantly be looking at the data. No longer, I shouldn't say no longer, not just focus on how many people you serve, but what happened when you served those people. You served 50 folks, 49 of them had an application to affordable housing. And those wait lists are long. 30 of them got their food stamp benefits. 15 of them got IDs. Whatever that is, we increase income by 30% of the population. What are we measuring? And here it talks about the things that you would like to measure: increased exits to permanent housing, decreased lengths of stay in shelter, a reduction in returns to homelessness. Like, those are the key performance measures at the top. And then, of course, there are other things: total amount of households entering shelter, how many households are exiting, what their destinations are, which is really important, and hopefully something that we're better at capturing. So these are some tools and tricks to really make sure that if we have the environment we're seeking and we are housing focused, and that people experiencing homelessness know that from the beginning, that we're looking for somewhere else for them to go to be successful, then that is part of the 5 keys of effective sheltering.
Great. Thank you so much, Ms. Ware. I really appreciate that. And I think between these 5 keys and then a lot of the learning that the municipality has done over the last several years, I do think that we have some good tools to bring forward so that we can be proactive with mitigation efforts, which I think is something that we have had difficulty doing in the past. We've been very reactive with mitigation rather than proactive. So hopefully we can do that in the future. And with whatever new shelters are brought on, do it right from day one. That's certainly a goal that I have. Any other discussion on this point before we move on?
This is Ken McCarty.
Yeah, go ahead.
To the chair, thank you very much for those 5 points and going over them again. Certainly, with the end in mind, and that 4th point of the focus on rapid exit and helping them get into housing, and then evaluating the data, I resonate with the comment there. And so that brings up, and with Assembly member bringing up the Zillow study and any other studies that we could add, as well as adding to or asking the advisory council to let's start collecting information or adding that to the survey of individuals that are coming from different places throughout Alaska, different villages, and what is their ability to go back to. I think that's going to help us to be more effective for Anchorage, to know how to, demographics and how to help. Thank you.
Thanks. Ms. Johnson?
And I just want to speak on the record. This is something that we're seeing, and I just want to make sure that it's communicated. Right now, we are facing some issues, not with a mass amount of people, but with, a small group of people, subpopulation, that there really is no difference from the Golden Lion housing or guest house housing and the option of non-congregate at the Aviator. We have $800 a month that some people are self-paying who are recently getting out of homelessness and are paying $800 a month for a non-congregate room that doesn't supply 3 meals a day. And then we have built out a system where now we have hotel rooms that are free of charge for people seeking shelter with 3 meals a day for free. And so there really is a struggle with some people who are trying to get evicted, knowing that they can have the exact same type of living situation at the Aviator or the Alex that they were paying $800 a month for at the Golden Lion. So that's something to put on record, just to start thinking of ideas to how to incentivize people getting out of emergency cold weather non-congregate sheltering and into housing when the burden is financial on them to get out of housing, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Ms. Johnson. All right, I think that ends this particular slide show. So let's go ahead and put on the second one, which is just 3 slides that I'm going to walk through. Let's go ahead and go to the next one, please. So this one really talks about, should we focus our attention on 150 bed, one of the questions that was asked last time, should we focus our attention on 150 bed location, or does it make sense to have some other combination of smaller shelters that add up to 150 beds? Looking at this question from both an operational and a financial perspective. So this one here, this is some information that the coalition put forward that I'll be speaking to that looks at 30 bed shelters. Next slide, please. So it compares all the different types of 30, excuse me, wrong. There we go. 30, similar to the last one. So 30 congregate shelter, 30 leased congregate shelter, 30 non-congregate shelter, 30 housing hotel, and then 30 MOA housing. And not surprisingly, shows the same kind of trend of the most expensive being congregate, slightly less expensive being non-congregate, least expensive being housing, whether that's through a hotel conversion or an MOA housing. Not too much of a difference there in terms of non-congregate versus congregate. Non-congregate's just a little bit less expensive than congregate, according to this data. Next slide, please. And overall, I think mainly because of number of locations, and it's also going to depend on whether it's one operator or multiple different operators is going to change the calculation for costs, but roughly 5 30-bed shelters or 3 50-bed shelters are just a little bit more expensive, but I don't think prohibitively more expensive than like one 100-bed shelter with the assumptions. And the shelter cost per person, again, going back to the last slide, still higher than the cost for housing. That doesn't really change whether you're doing 30 shelter, 30 housing, 150 shelter, 150 housing. It's still cheaper housing versus shelter. But yeah, overall, my take on the information and data is that there's not too much of a difference whether you do a bunch of smaller shelters or one bigger shelter. The cost difference is fairly minimal. It's going to depend on staffing and it depend on number of operators. That's going to be your biggest, I think, assumptions that will drive the costs. Any other discussion on this point? Yeah, go ahead.
I may have done the math wrong. It looked like 150 housing, non-congregate housing for 150 people was $2 million, but it was $1 million per 30, which would be $5 million. That seems like double. Or did I do the math wrong?
Let's see.
Because if it's just a little different, that would be awesome. But if it's huge different, then I don't know if we're going to be able to sell it.
Yeah, Taria, do you think you might be able to speak to that question?
So I will say on record that I'm not speaking to this slide because we really, so there are a lot of unknowns in speaking to it, right? But what I will say is that that's part of the issue, right? Is not understanding how people staff down to kind of look at how the price might change. But it is a significant difference. So the slide that I can speak to was the 5 million for 150 people was based on the cost that the community definitely agreed to with the Emergency Shelter Task Force. And this slide that is 30 folks, all that was done to create this slide by whoever created it was to take a third of each thing and cut it by a third, cut a third from each of the subject lines that equal into the $1.5 million that you're seeing here for, let's say, congregate shelter. So if you took that number and times it by, times it by 2/3 or whatever, you would get your 5 million, because there are so many things that you can do differently. You could have one shelter provider who's going to cover multiple sites, and therefore they would only have one accounting department, and so their costs would be different. Or they'd have one person over 3 shelters, so their staffing structure would be different. Or they'd have an on-call pool. Like, there's so many different unknowns that this particular graph was not vetted by a community of experts, but based on the sheer math that would be involved to go from 150 to 30. If that's helpful, Member Felix.
No, thanks. That is, and I think key points there is just there's just too many unknowns and too many assumptions to really look at the comparison between the two. I think the easiest comparison would be is 150 person shelter run by one operator, and then 5 30-person shelters run by one operator. I think that's the easiest comparison to make, and I think in that case costs aren't too different. Once you get to 100, like 3 or 4 different operators running these 5 different shelters, then I think the costs start to add on. Okay. Then I think that's it for the slides. So we can go ahead and take that down. So then there were a few other questions that were asked that weren't addressed in these slides. So I'm just going to go through these quickly and then talk about next steps. So why isn't SWS not highlighted on the map? That was something that I think the Midtown representative asked. To be honest, I am not sure why it wasn't on the map, other than possibly that MOA land, vacant land was on the map, but not MOA buildings. I didn't notice MOA buildings on the map, and that is what SWS is. So I imagine that is the discrepancy, that the map, for whatever reason, excluded MOA buildings, probably imagining that we didn't want to use those as shelter. So that is what I'm imagining, but I haven't gotten that confirmed just yet. Next question. How many, and this was already addressed, I think, a little bit. Mr. McCarty asked this: how many folks can go back to the village, and what are the criteria? And by and large, just based on what Ms. Ware said, the coalition does not track that information, and I don't think really anyone tracks that kind of information, except for maybe through the grapevine. I do hear that maybe some groups like South Central Foundation maybe track some of that kind of information, and perhaps the campus, the Alaska Native campus, might also track some of that information as well. What do we want our summers to look like? What will transition out of emergency cold weather shelter look like? That was another question asked that wasn't addressed on one of these slides. And for folks who have attended the regular committees, we're actually talking about that, and we're going to be starting to delve into that in more detail next month and in the coming months. I think you'll see us talk about emergency cold weather shelter transition more thoroughly. I don't necessarily know if that's something that this particular subcommittee will tackle. And then the last question that was asked was capacity analysis for staffing. is someone doing that? And the short answer is no, there's really no one that's doing that. I think generally from what I hear, there is always a need and desire for more staffing. And in fact, from what I hear and understand, we're at pretty much like max capacity for the system that we have now. We would need a new operator or increased staffing within our current operators in order to take more on, which is, I think, something that we're going to have to tackle. Once we do get to a decision point on additional shelter, I think that is a key question that we're going to have to figure out is how are we going to staff this additional shelter and what is that going to look like? Because I'm just imagining if we do get a new shelter up and running by April or sometime during the summer of next year, and then we have to go out and ask people to run emergency cold weather shelter because, as I've said repeatedly, we're going to need emergency cold weather shelter in some form. Hopefully it gets smaller and smaller. I can imagine a situation where people maybe can run the permanent shelter, but then when we get to the temporary winter shelter, we may run out of people to actually do that work next year. So that is certainly something that's top of mind for us to have to figure out. Any other discussion points that folks want to bring up? Otherwise, those were all of the questions that folks had as sort of the foundational questions, things you wanted to talk about, learn more about before we really dived into locations, which is, I'm going to talk about those next steps of diving into locations in a minute. But any other discussion that folks want to have before we do that? Okay, great. I think we've sufficiently talked it to death. So now we're going to go ahead and move forward on locations and get that work done. So there are locations going to be done in a two-phase process. First is November 8th, next Wednesday. We're meeting here from 10 to 11:30 a.m. to focus on the process for locations. So what do we as a group want the location process to look like? I'll come forward with a draft, an example of that, and some draft ideas, and then we'll finalize that. And then we'll run through that process between the meeting on the 8th and then the week of the 27th. There is no official meetings on the calendar yet, but that week, as I've stated before, will be the week that we go through and go through that process in detail, through the results of that process, and talk about a short list for us to take to town halls, which begin, I believe, on December 2nd is the first town of a series of 3 town halls. So the week of November 27th, again, no meeting dates have been scheduled just yet because I'm waiting until next week to finalize the process. And then we can schedule those meetings on the week of November 27th. But that is going to be the week that we go through and figure out the results of that process. And then really, I think things will be moving much more quickly at that point. Any other discussion before we close out this meeting?
Through the chair, this is Ken McCarty.
Yes, go ahead.
You mentioned that the map did not include structures that the Muni has. Can we get that information so that we can consider that as locations?
Yeah, thanks. So certainly I can look at maybe getting, there's certain locations. I don't think, we're going to kick, for example, AWU out of their building and turn that into a shelter. I don't think that's something that's going to happen. But if there are locations that make sense that are vacant or things like that, underutilized, I can look at getting those locations together. Honestly, the only one that I can think of is the oldest SWS administration building. I can't think of any others right now, but I'll mull more on that and send you all the information. Yeah, go ahead, Ms. Barley.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just briefly, I think, just to add some context, I think we've had discussion, or the city has had discussion over the last couple of years. Recreation centers are off the table. The Sullivan Arena is off the table. Other hockey arenas, as far as I can tell, are off the table. I think that would be a misstep of us to attempt that again. And then also, the other properties like the SWS building are essentially owned by a different agency. So it's part of the city broadly, but we're not paying a lease on it for various reasons, but we essentially have to pay the cost for any enterprise owned building. So for example, if we turn the port into a shelter, again, not saying we do that, the port is a separate entity, and so we would need to pay them. So I want to just also put on the table, if we're looking at city buildings, that we would really need to distinguish whether it's one that's owned by the municipality as part of our general government separately from any that are owned by another utility or enterprise entity, because the cost is different and the implications are different. And we've already discovered that. We figured a way around it for this winter, but long term, I think that also needs to be. So just to say, it's not. We don't have a lot of city-owned buildings kicking around, and then a lot of them do actually have a fair amount of cost compared to the private sector.
Thanks. Any other discussion? All right, not seeing any, I'll go ahead and I think our last member of the audience left, but is there any audience participation? Are there any other members on the phone? No? Okay, then with that, I'll go ahead and adjourn, and I'll see you all next week.